Everybody, and this is Jim Price. I'm the CEO of ICOMM. Thank you very much for joining this webinar, and as Scott said, we'll walk through sort of what we see as sort of some best strategies for how to manage a mobile environment. We do this for tens of thousands of mobile devices across a number of mid-size and Fortune 500 clients, and so we've run into all sorts of different, not just ways in which companies think they should do this, but ways in which they have to do this based upon how their users are utilizing the devices themselves, the types of carriers they have, both in the States, Canada, and internationally. And we'll sort of touch upon a number of things we think are most important for people to know for how to properly manage that environment from a number of different perspectives. And so we'll go ahead and just get into it. Look very quickly sort of at our agenda. We are going to touch upon bring your own device policies, which is something that was very popular for a while and still is for some organizations. We'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll talk about how you'd keep an inventory, how you'd make sure that you're getting good contracts, and sort of how to continue to make sure ongoing that you're properly managing the environment so that they work for your users and that you're making sure that you're doing it in the most cost-effective way possible. So that's the agenda, and we'll touch on each of those points. Okay, jumping into things here. So obviously there's a number of things, including safety, that need to go into a wireless policy document. So oftentimes these are clauses that will touch upon things like never using a mobile device when you're in a car, not bringing in a camera phone into a secure area. There's a number of policy statements like that that often corporate security and human resources get involved in helping our IT organizations write. But beyond that, once you get a policy in place that works for everybody in the organization, and for what it's worth, most large companies don't have good policies around this when we first meet them. It is something of an afterthought for each of the pieces upon it, and they're things that need to be continually evolving, right? We typically are helping clients rewrite their mobile policies maybe every year or two, and those are people who are sort of on top of it. So it's something that's not necessarily front and center for most organizations, but is really where you'd start. Who should have a phone? How should they be using it? How is the phone being paid for? What types of metrics do we want to have behind the use of those services so we can make sure that people are using it safely and appropriately for work? And so we'll kind of walk through some of those things. Once you get that policy in place and some of the items, how do you best monitor it? And so there are a number of ways in which you can do that. But once you have the policy in place, you're still going to have people. And this is part of it. There's a number of software packages that generally would fall under the category of something called mobile device management. BlackBerry, in essence, was a mobile device management platform. The biggest names today are companies like VMware's AirWatch product and a company called Mobile Iron. And in essence, what this is, it's a software as a service normally product that really puts a certificate and a few controls on an iPhone or an Android device or a Windows mobile device and helps manage and maintain that. It can roll out applications to the phones, it can track usage and usage policies, and it can wipe the phone if the phone is lost or if employees no longer within an organization. And so using software like that along with data you'd get from the wireless carrier can help make sure that you're monitoring these policies. But then beyond it, you need to decide how is an organization paying for phones. And so just to take a step back, the concept of bring your own device is really a very broad concept that doesn't necessarily mean one thing. What it originally meant, and it really started with the iPhone, was that organizations didn't necessarily allow an iPhone in formally, wouldn't pay for one, but users found them incredibly useful and they brought them in and sort of wanted to have at least email set up on them. So they were bringing in their own device to an environment, and this happens in the IT space more broadly, people bringing in Macs or higher-end laptops, but in the mobile world, this is really where it started. And the idea behind it evolved, right? So some IT organizations saw this as a way in which they could stop paying for the hardware behind those devices. Hey, users are going to have their own phones. Why don't they choose their phones? Maybe there's a limit to the number of phones we would allow on the network from a security perspective, but a user could get their own phone, bring it in, maybe or maybe not the organization would pay for the plan. All that stuff sort of needs to be decided under the policy. And we can talk a little bit about, the pros and cons of each of them. From our perspective, we have a handful of clients that still use some amount of BYOD, but most of their phones are on what we would call a corporate-owned platform from at least the monthly perspective. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more. But obviously, you've got a lot of data. If you've got hundreds or thousands of mobile devices, you have to somehow know how to tie those to users. Who are they? Who are the users? Are they still actively employed? From a billing perspective, are you going to centralize the billing into an IT cost center, or are those costs for the mobile devices going to go out to the individual cost centers? And how do you manage all that? That's a lot of the stuff that needs to go into sort of the planning stage of what we're discussing here. Okay. So as I mentioned, there's a couple different ways to do this using internal tools and external carrier data. Again, sort of focusing on the billing part of it, which is not always the most important part, but certainly a part that drives our conversations for the enterprises we work with. The carriers, AT&T, Verizon, companies like that, have a number of different ways in which an organization can manage their phones. So the simplest one at all, of course, would be you tell your end users you're paying for your own phone. We're going to give you a certificate to put on your device that will allow you access to email and other network resources, and it's 100% offloaded to the employee. There are a couple of large organizations historically that have done that with success. There's a larger number of organizations that attempted to do that and then dialed it back and brought those costs in-house, and again, we'll talk a little bit about that. There's other ways the carriers allow for this to do it. Some things called co-pay or split billing, where the voice piece of a phone may reside with the end user from a personal level, and the data portion of the bill, your data usage, your email access would go to the organization. And so some of those tools are easy ways to make sure that you're spreading the cost of the mobile devices around. But what we found again is that most organizations at most are only doing a subset of their users in something like bring your own device. And I think we'd be interested to know, if anyone is using BYOD exclusively and how it's going. But really wanting to own the device, wanting to own the data on the device, wanting to have a very clear handle on what the costs are going to be going forward, those three items really drive most organizations to own the phone or the number, if not the hardware, to make sure that they have all that information readily available to them. And you have to think about how much work goes into your management of their phone. So if it's a phone that you own, that the organization owns, and the end user has a problem with that phone, an IT representative can call the carrier and very easily be authorized to work on that phone on behalf of your end user. If the phone is owned by the end user, if they call into the help desk is a little bit more limited, or at a minimum, the end user has to be more actively involved in the troubleshooting of whatever's going on. And so there's some balancing there that you have to take into account. And in addition, on the billing side, if the phone is 100% owned by the corporation, and the user only sort of has visibility to their usage, and they're only going to need to do something with it if there's a large variance, like an expense report if they were roaming in Europe or something like that. They don't have to do a lot with it, but if it's their own device and they have to expense it, every single month they're having to pull up their own bill, go through the line item of the bill and decide what needs to be expensed to the company and what doesn't. All those things take time and resources away from your employees that in a model where it's more corporate owned, there's a little bit less they have to do. But again, it's a balance over what you're looking for. If you're focusing more on cost savings and accountability versus productivity and performance gain, there's ways in which you can balance that. Okay, moving on a little bit more. As we were talking about, there's a couple different tools that the carriers offer you to how you're going to split up the cost of the billing. And some things to note from a contract perspective. We have clients, as I mentioned, that have very few corporate-owned devices, but one of them in particular, a large law firm, has 12,000 phones that are employee-owned, but actually due go towards the commitment for that entity's discounts, right? So, this is one of the ones where it's a corporate benefit, an employee benefit to link your phone to the corporate account. You get a much larger discount than you would doing it individually, and that actually helps make the organization's contract with the AT&Ts and Verizons of the world much richer, better discounts, better waivers, things like that, even though there's only a small number of phones that are owned by the corporation. As alluded to a couple times here, most of our clients are some sort of mixed environment where there's a number of corporate responsible phones, and by the way, it's typically across multiple carriers. We don't have many entities that we work with that just have phones with AT&T or just have phones with Verizon, especially if they're nationwide, let alone international. They're saying, well, people on the East Coast have a preference for Verizon, people in the Midwest may have a preference for AT&T, and how do you manage that? And so the tool set, having this more standardized across the board does have an impact both on your IT organizations and your AP organizations in regards to how all this data is handled. The last bullet point on the slide we're looking at right now, one of the things we're going to talk about here is inventory. What type of inventory do you have? What sort of tool do you have your mobile inventory in today? And what types of things are you feeding into that inventory to check things? And so the one I'm saying here is track an employee status, especially if your organization's a little bit larger. What happens when an employee who has either a BYOD phone or a corporate-owned phone leaves? Who's in charge of gathering that phone up? Who's in charge of making sure there's no corporate data on the device? Who's in charge of either transferring that phone to another employee or turning the plans off on that device? If the device was bought under a contract, there could be an early termination fee. How's that being tracked? And if you're trying to do this in a spreadsheet, as many organizations do, you have to do this manually, right? So you have a spreadsheet that you might pull down from the carrier's website. You're somehow going to have to get a feed from your like who's still an active employee. How do those things interact together? That's really the key in managing mobility is really change and variance management. Has someone spent more on a phone 1 month versus the other, or less? Is there no usage on a phone? Has an employee changed from employee to contractor or from employee to terminated? And what do you do? And obviously having a tool that does those things helps greatly, but at least having access to that data is really key to getting this right. Okay. So I mentioned inventory. Having an inventory that's sort of an interactive data set really helps people manage their mobile environment. So as I mentioned, having the inventory, knowing when an employee is onboarded or offboarded is a big piece of that. But then really just knowing, well, how much am I spending on each phone? Are they on the right plan? This is something that people talk about a lot, of course, something we would call optimization. It's lovely now that a lot of the carriers have pooled voice and pooled data, and so sometimes it's easy to put users in a pool and there's not a whole lot of optimization you need to do. But the pool size can change. Some users, and again, because carrier plans can be different, sometimes it makes sense to not have users in a pool. One way to look at this is if everyone's in a pool, but there's not a ton of data usage going on, you're probably overpaying for the data. If you have a lot of people in the pool and it's really high data usage, you might be paying overages because you need to be in a larger pool. There's still work that needs to be done there. Having an inventory that can import in the invoice itself, the usage data, the cost data, allows you to do give you a better view of that data. Some carrier websites do that, but they don't necessarily let you import in the employee data. And it's not always going to have stuff like the contract end dates for phones, which would determine if you need to cancel a line, what the termination fee would be. All that stuff in a tool is better. But then having that data when you go to contract, if you're going to renew a contract, which you can do more frequently than you would think, obviously having the data, what do we spend, what is my usage, all that data can go into helping you get a better contract. If you know you're spending a lot more on data, you're a more valuable customer to the carriers, and they're going to be willing to offer you a bigger discount. They're going to be willing to offer you waivers on devices if you're buying a lot more phones. And so having one resource for that information, when you go into contracting, you're going to be a much more informed consumer with the carrier, and that's a great way to make sure that you're getting the best deal possible. And then, as we started off on, having access to that data shows you who's really in compliance, is everyone in compliance. There's some risk management and risk mitigation information that could come out of having that sort of interactive inventory of your mobile devices and its usage and its cost. Okay, moving on here. All right, so how do you get there? How do you get to that point where you have an inventory? As I said, people can do it with a spreadsheet. You could create an Access database. There are companies like ICOMM that sell tool sets to do this. There are ones that are freely available on the internet that you can load it up and upload data into without a cost, and the carriers have some tools as well. But fully auditing it, that phrase there on the first bullet point, what we mean by that is going through every single line, making sure that any feature on the line is appropriate. Should someone have or not have text messaging? Are they an active employee? Are they an employee at a level of hierarchy that has been approved for a phone? Is the phone that they have approved, is the plan they're on approved? All that sort of stuff goes into the audited inventory, and it's something that you kind of need to look at least, once a month to say, are they still in that exact state? Once you have the inventory in place, it's clearly a lot easier to look at it from a variance perspective, but building that up is sort of the first step. And then from that, you'd be able to see all of the usage across those devices. How's that going? Are there extra costs? Being able to have that visibility on a per user basis or a per manager basis gives you the ability to sort of target where you need to work with people across the board. All right, next slide. Okay, so we've talked about a couple of things, and I imagine some of these at this point, flow directly from the data that you've gathered, right? So once you have an inventory in place, you need to ask yourself, where are we on our contract? If you have a year left in your contract with someone like an AT&T or Verizon, you actually can go back to them early and say, hey, I have a year left, but we're not planning on moving off of your service. We'd like to do a new 2-year contract now, and they get the benefit of having you locked in for a longer period of time, and you get the benefit for potentially getting better rates, waivers, discounts, and terms on the contract. But again, knowing your complete inventory, knowing the opportunity that the carrier would have from you really helps you come to the table in a much better negotiating position. There's a bullet point here that says, are all your devices on the same term? So there's two things we want to clear up here. There's two terms. You have a contract term that would be like based on your master service agreement with a carrier, and then the term of a device would be, when did you buy it, right? So you'll see, the carriers are moving this around a little bit, but if you're buying a phone on a 2-year term, you might not do that until a year into your contract, your MSA, and you'd have 12 months afterwards that you still need to run that phone or pay a penalty. All those things, again, having access to this sort of data really helps you when you get to the negotiating table. And then the final bullet point here is, having access to the latest rate plans and promotions. Probably not surprisingly, the carriers have fairly complex rate tables. They certainly have a number of ones that they highlight, but there are other ones that are not necessarily listed. They're not obligated to list these on a website like they might have to be in a consumer world, in the enterprise world. And so having a little bit of expertise around what rate plans are available, are there any promotions going on, and these promotions can be anything from 12-month waiver of free text messaging to a discounted phone, to a special plan that has a rate that's only good for the period of time you might sign the contract, but then it will last for 2 years going forward. So having visibility to that and knowing that the carriers won't always be leading with those deals right off the bat, using an outside resource sometimes for that thing can make sense. All right, so some of the key components to look at when you're doing a contract review. So clearly you're signing a contract, you should have a discount. What we're giving you there is a little range. We have seen a little bit above 25% for large enterprises, and the base rate that they start at for a company that would be 20 phones would be 8%. So at a minimum, You want to make sure that you're getting a discount that's appropriate to the size of your organization, to the number of phones that you would have under contract. Then they're doing something more than just saying, please sign a contract. They're either putting in you're willing to spend X number of dollars a year with us, or have X number of phones under contract. And remember, under contract can mean corporate-owned phones, but then phones that are owned by employees and their families that are linked to your contract. And so if you have an organization that has, a decent number of phones, but there's a lot more people who work for your company and their families that are using that same carrier, you should encourage them through your HR process, through an employee intranet, to make sure that they're signing up for the employee discount for this. It benefits them and it can benefit the organization. The types of things we look for in the commitment level is that you have flexibility. So if you have 100 devices, you might only want to say, well, I'm only willing to commit to 50 of them, because obviously if you drop below the commitment level, your terms could change. And if you decide over time that you want to move carriers, changing from Verizon to AT&T or from T-Mobile to Sprint, having that flexibility built into your contract is something you want to balance with the larger discounts you get for having a higher commitment. Then the last bullet point here is something that's really good. When an employee leaves and their phone is still under contract, you're typically going to hopefully take that phone and give it to another new employee, but you don't always do that. Additionally, employees have a tendency to break phones. We keep track of some of these things, and being lost in the back of a taxi cab or an Uber and being dropped in a toilet are two items that come up an awful lot. When that happens, if the phone's not under some sort of warranty plan, you might owe a brand new phone, and what you can do is negotiate these things called an early termination fee waiver, and you can often get it for about 10% of your phones. So if you have 50 phones, you can negotiate 5 early termination fee waivers where the phone that was left in the back of a cab, you can get that person a new phone under contract by invoking an early termination fee waiver and not having to pay the $600, $700, $800 replacement fee. That's something you have to ask for. It's not put in contracts automatically, but again, it's something that look for in your contract and see what's there. And again, we've seen it where even contracts under 100 devices are able to get at least a handful of those. Okay, couple things as we get close to the end here, talking about sort of how do you make sure that you're doing this as efficiently as possible. If you've got 5 mobile accounts with AT&T, there's probably no reason why you couldn't put those all on contract. That would make sure that they're all getting the same discount, that they're all falling under the same sorts of negotiated plans, and it's 4 less invoices that someone has to look at individually. Obviously, that data can be grabbed online and put into an extractable data format, but depending upon how you're doing that, make sure that's something you look at. There's no reason to have multiple accounts in the mobile world. In the wireline voice world, sometimes there's reasons why you'd need multiple invoices. Even if they're being paid for by different groups within your organization, there are ways to get that worked out. And so there's some efficiencies there. And then you want to do this sort of variance review. Are you getting the discount that you have on the contract? Are the plans the right ones? Are there any changes that haven't hit the plan? If you got a promotion with a discount or a waiver, is that showing up each and every month? And doing that review, it's sort of granular. It takes a little time to do it right. It's easier to do it if you're in a tool or at least in a spreadsheet. But every single contract is what the carriers would refer to mostly as an individually case-based contract. So they're complicated and they often don't get implemented correctly. Our organization, when we come into a new client, it is almost every single client has at least one contract, one set of accounts and invoices that they think they're getting some sort of discounts or specialized pricing on, and there's something wrong with that pricing. And I would say it's in the 90% range, not surprisingly, that those mistakes on the invoice benefit the carrier, not the customer. Very rare, of course, that the carrier is undercharging an organization, but it's very usual that a carrier would be overcharging an organization. And again, part of it is due to the complexity of their contracts, but you really need to be diligent about reviewing it, when the new contract implements, but then ongoing. Okay, moving on to about the last slide here. So some of the things we do for our clients on a monthly basis that, again, You can do manually, you can do in a spreadsheet. It gets easier if you're using a more robust inventory application. But we really look for these things. So if there's any sort of unnecessary or unapproved service package, people adding a GPS program, people doing application downloads, making sure those are grabbed, stopped, that if it's an employee policy violation, that somehow the employee is contacted to make sure that those aren't in there. If people are on a roaming plan but haven't been traveling abroad, you want to get rid of that. Anything like that, you kind of want to audit each device monthly and make sure that it really is on the right set of plans and features. As we mentioned, having a tie-in to your employee file really makes the next step possible. We've had some of the carriers tell us that 10% and more of many of their enterprise customers are zero usage device phones. So it's a phone or an air card mobile device that you're paying $45 a month for that has no usage on it. Oftentimes we find that those are sitting in managers' drawers. They let an employee go 3 months ago. They didn't know what to do with the device. They put it in their drawer. It continues to bill to the enterprise. Those are things that are very easy to see if you're looking at the invoice regularly and kind of tying that into an employee inventory, device inventory, all that stuff that we mentioned before really helps you narrow your focus down to that correctly. And the very last bullet point here, mobile environments, there's a lot of change. People are getting new phones, they're changing rate plans, they're doing various things. You're needing to make sure that the invoices are approved, that it goes through the invoice approval process, your internal workflow for that, that AP is paying it out on time, that if it's being charged to multiple cost centers within an organization, all that work needs to be done really, almost like a conveyor belt to make sure that every step is being done at the right time. And this helps avoid late fees, make sure that the cost centers are being charged the right amount of money. All that stuff takes a process. You have to do it as a process. And if you have a smaller organization, one person can do that. But if you have a large organization, you have a number of people who are interacting together. And so having a formalized process behind that, even if it's not something like a full-blown application or an outsourced service that a company like ICOMM might offer, just making sure you're doing each and every one of those steps on a monthly basis is important. Okay. So we went through a number of things. I think we're right about the time, maybe just a little bit later than we had said. Scott, I think the last slide is just a little bit about ICOMM, but why don't we see if anybody had any questions or has anything they'd like to ask us.
Sure, sounds great. Thanks, Jim. So I saw some people joined after I'd already talked over the sending in questions at the beginning. Basically, if you have any questions, now's the time to send them in. We have on your GoToWebinar control panel, you should see a little question box at the bottom. Just type that in. That'll be sent to me. Anything about mobile services at all, really. All right, so we have a few, so let's go on and get started. One is, what should a small business, say 30 users, expect to pay for mobility management software that you discussed? And part two, can we manage it ourselves, or do we need an IT support company to help?
Right. So at that level, and this is something we could take offline, there are some online tools. I mentioned that there are some free products, right? So just to say it, the typical price range for a smaller sized entity, so we would say, under 250 devices, the going rate across the industry is perhaps as much as $10 a month per phone, which we don't think, there's not a very good value proposition behind that, right? So you're not going to get $300 a month in savings by having that software. Now, you might get that from a soft cost perspective, right? How much efficiency are you getting from having a device loaded in, or I'm sorry, having an invoice loaded in electronically, spitting out a file that you can give into your AP group so that those numbers are coded, the numbers are coded correctly. Things like that, I think what we could do is we could take it offline and we could point you in the direction of a handful of free services. But the carriers themselves, if those 30 devices are all on the AT&T website or on Verizon or T-Mobile, they have tools that you can use a lot of the services behind what we were talking about here. So adding in cost center data, adding in employee name, all that stuff can be done less expensively when you're at that size. and with just a little bit of advice behind, what are the rate plans that you should be looking at. Again, even a small company like that, you should at least be getting a 20% discount. You probably can make sure you're on pooled plans, both for voice data. You should have unlimited text messaging unless you don't use it, and then you should not pay for it at all. Those are some things that I would look for a company of that size.
And then another question is, can you share a sample mobile policy?
Yes, so we have some that are sort of thinned down, and Scott, I believe we're going to post a package that includes in the slides as part of the wrapping up of this webinar that people would have a link to. Is that correct?
Yeah, we can send that out after the fact in an email. Everybody will be receiving an email with a video of this, and we can also send that link out as well.
Yeah, and so what we can do, Scott, is we'll put a handful of the sort of the clauses and the pages of a mobile policy at the back of this presentation. That's the one that can go out. And yeah, there's a lot of language that large-scale HR departments and IT departments want to modify when they see these templates. But I think there's some stuff that really does cover the basics. And again, it's going to include stuff like, do not use your corporate-owned phone when you're driving a car, even on non-company time. The enterprise could still be liable for that if it's owned by the corporation. Through how phones are procured and the use of them. Please don't use Netflix streaming on your phone. Those types of things can be in a templated policy we'll put out there.
Okay, so everybody just keep your eye out for that, and we'll have that going out in an email. We got time for one or two more questions, then we should probably wrap up. One that we have is, I'm considering moving to business devices. Are certain devices like iPhone, Android, BlackBerry better or safer for my business?
Right. So each of them would have an argument that they are better or not, and it really depends on a couple of different things, right? So sometimes the companies that manufacture software, what I call mobile device management software, they're not as big of fans of Apple because Apple has a much more locked down operating system on their phone. What that means is that we can't get in with our mobile device management software and really take over the phone, customize the user experience. But what that also means is that phone is much more secure. It has a higher degree of ability to block malware programs. There's things you can lock down a little bit more. And so, again, Android would say there's third-party software you can use that can really control a phone. But an Apple iPhone has, built in sort of a deeper security, right? It's not meant to be customized as much, so there's less things that someone could do maliciously. Just to say it, at the highest level, using a mobile device management platform, what our most security-conscious enterprises do, and think about this from a law firm perspective, right? A mobile phone that gets left in the back of a car is totally the soft underbelly of corporate America, right? There could be data on that you could get to. Somebody could open up, contract documents, financial data. What they do is the mobile device management platform has this thing that's referred to as a sandbox. And the idea behind this is no data actually sits on the phone. So our largest law firm clients do this where, and it doesn't matter if it's an iPhone or an Android device, but again, to the point of the question, some of this depends on the security level you're talking about. But it's almost like using Citrix, right? You're on your phone, you're looking at images of data that sits in your corporate environment. You have to be online to view the data. Once the phone locks, you need 2 passwords to get back into it. A password for the phone and a password for the Citrix-like application. So that can spread across them, but really what we see is Android devices have a whole lot of different versions and flavors, and the Apple devices have a little bit less, and they're a little bit more locked down. So we often will recommend iPhones for less sophisticated or IT departments that have less resources because it's simplified. It's the same platform. It's easier to troubleshoot, and it's easier to have secure. So it's probably a longer answer to the question, but I think trying to boil it down to the basics, hopefully that's a good explanation.
That's great. Thanks, Jim. Unless anybody else has any questions, I think we're just about running out of time. So I think now would be a good time to wrap up. Thanks again, Jim, and everyone at ICOMM for putting this presentation together. Like we said earlier, everybody will be receiving an email later with a video replaying this webinar and also the information that we discussed a couple minutes ago. From everyone here at SwitchFast, we just want to thank you for attending today's presentation. Be sure to check our site, switchfast.com, and our social pages. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn for more great content and news on upcoming webinars. All right, thanks again, everybody, and everyone have a good day.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everyone. Bye.